Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Today we're going to do something a little different than what we normally do. Now, we've looked before at the Amarna Letters, a collection of correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and the emperors and vassals who were his contemporaries. This collection is hugely important because it's dated to a short period of Egyptian history, only about 20 years. So it helps us piece together a lot of other historical events based on what's described in the letters. Now, while these letters have a lot of historical value, they also detail some events and figures that are just plain entertaining. We're going to dig into one of these narratives today. We are going to look at the story of Abdi-Ashirta, a ruler of the Egyptian vassal state in modern-day Syria during the Late Bronze Age. We'll look at the time when he lived, and we'll recount the events of his life as best we can reconstruct them based on correspondence from and about him in the Amarna Letters. Now, this story has some great entertainment value. It's also a great exercise in reconstructing history from ancient sources, and it even has some relevance for how we understand the Bible and some of the characters in the Bible today. Let's dig in. Now, this story takes place in the Late Bronze Age in what is now Syria, a region which was then called Amuru. Now, Amuru was at times the general name given for the land of the Amorites, but in the 14th century BC, it's applied more specifically to this strip of land between the Mediterranean coast and the Orontes Valley. This was an important and by extension volatile area in the Late Bronze Age. This part of Syria fell under the control of the Egyptian pharaohs after the campaigns of Thutmose III in the mid-15th century, but this continued to be a contested area. It was at the convergence of the three great empires of the day, with the Hittites to the north, based in what's now Turkey, the kingdom of Mitanni, centered in the Khabur Triangle in what's now northern Syria and Iraq, and of course the new kingdom Egyptian Empire. Each of these empires had ambitions for controlling Syria because it had wealthy cities on lucrative trade routes and vital transportation networks. During the 15th and early 14th centuries, Egypt and Mitanni, the two states which had been the most dominant in this area, agreed on a treaty that established a border between them. Now, while it's not entirely clear where the border was, it seems to be around the Orontes River. South of the river was Egyptian territory, while north and east was Mitannian territory. This allowed these empires to consolidate their power bases and secure themselves against the growing threat in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire. By the mid-14th century, Egypt had an established system of indirect imperial control in the region. There were Egyptian forts and governors throughout their Asiatic empire, but they mostly ruled through a system of native, loyal vassal kings who governed their traditional city-states. Now, this was a good system for Egypt. Tribute payments flowed to the pharaoh from the local kings or mayors, who also kept the peace, for the most part. They only occasionally required the pharaoh to come and put down rebellions or depose disloyal vassals. This is the system we see at work during the Amarna period. The Amarna period is roughly the middle of the 14th century, around 1350 to 1330 or so, when the pharaoh Akhenaten moved his capital to a new city, the modern city of Amarna. This new capital was quickly abandoned for the city of Thebes by his successor Tutankhaten, who changed his name to Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut. Now, because the city's occupation was short-lived, it is incredibly important for archaeology for a number of reasons. Most relevant for us today is that from this site we have a cache of about 300 cuneiform texts, which are largely diplomatic correspondence. We have a whole video on them that you can check out here if you like. Some texts date to prior to Akhenaten's reign, to the reign of his father Amenhotep III, maybe around 1360 or the early 1350s. The latest texts seem to be early in the reign of Tutankhamun, around 1330. Now, some of these texts are from the great kings of the other empires, Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus, and Mitanni. But most of the letters are from the vassal kings of the pharaoh. They're writing about tribute, asking for aid, complaining about their neighbors. Lots of complaining about their neighbors, actually. Now, from these letters, we get an in-depth view of the geopolitics of Syria-Palestine in the mid-14th century. Now, these aren't narratives that describe historical events in detail, but you can read between the lines a bit, and with some educated guesses, you can reconstruct a tentative history. There is a lot of drama that is detailed in these letters, and this is where we encounter Abdi-Ashirta, our main character. Whether he's a hero or a villain will be up for you to decide. The sources for our story come from 6 letters from Abdi-Ashirta himself, as well as from the most verbose of the Egyptian vassals, Rib-Hadda, who wrote around 60 letters.
Abdi-Ashirta was an Amorite warlord. We don't have many biographical details about him, but his name means servant of Astartu, or the goddess elsewhere known as Ashura. He was apparently from the region of Amuru, and first appears in the Egyptian records during the reign of Amenhotep III. He had apparently risen to be the most dominant leader in all of Amuru, and he seemingly did this through uniting various bands of Habiru warriors. We're going to do a whole video on the Habiru or apiru, but for now we'll define this group briefly. Habiru, especially during the Amarna period, are referred to dispossessed, socially outcast people who left their original communities either to escape legal consequences, debt, war, something else, and they sought fortunes somewhere away from home, typically in bands of similarly situated people. These people often caused unrest wherever they went. Canaanite kings of the Amarna period hated the Habiru. They used the term as an insult, sometimes calling a rival king a Habiru, and seemed to use it almost synonymously with how we would use the word terrorist. Now, the Habiru seemed to be some combination of Robin Hood, soldiers of fortune, and terrorists. Well, these people are the power base of Abdi-Ashirta. He unites numerous bands who become loyal to him. But Habiru loyalty seems to last only as long as things are good, as long as the war loot continues to flow. So this puts Abdi-Ashirta in a tight position. He was a vassal of Pharaoh, and he didn't dare risk conflict with Mitanni across the Orontes. But expansion with Amuru meant conflict with other Egyptian vassals. So what does he do? Well, first, he strikes against the cities of Ardata and Yerkata. After there are no apparent consequences, he strikes against the city of Sumer. Now, Sumer was an important Egyptian base, and Amenhotep had put a trusted Egyptian official named Pahanate in charge of it. Pahanate was supposed to be president of the city, but on one occasion he was gone, and Abdi-Ashirta attacked the city. This doesn't seem to be a coincidence. Abdi-Ashirta times the attack carefully. This is the context of the letter EA60, the first letter from Abdi-Ashirta in the archive. In this letter, he swears his fealty to the pharaoh. He says he is his servant and the dirt under his feet, and then he goes on to not only defend himself, but blame Pahanate for Abdi-Ashirta seizing Sumer. He blames the official for not defending Amuru from the Mitannians, something Abdi-Ashirta claims he does on Pharaoh's behalf, making himself the self-appointed guardian of Amuru from all threats, both foreign and domestic, as it were. He says that while the commissioner was gone, the city needed somebody to watch over it, so that's all Abdi-Ashirta was doing. Now, the reader should be skeptical. In light of what we know historically, Abdi-Ashirta was clearly trying to ingratiate himself to the pharaoh to avoid any recourse for his attack on Sumer. Now, as you can imagine, Pahanate was not happy about this. In a letter to Pahanate, Abdi-Ashirta defends himself, pointing blame directly back onto the Egyptian. He says incredulously, "What do your words, my lord, that you speak mean? My lord, you speak like this. You are an enemy of Egypt, and you committed a crime against Egyptians." But Abdi-Ashirta protests, "There were no men in Sumer to guard it as he had ordered." He's basically saying, you abandoned your post the pharaoh gave you. What are you going to do about it? He claims he saved the city from another rival force under someone named Shehlal, and only because of decisive action on behalf of the pharaoh was Abdi-Ashirta able to save the city which Pahanate had left so ill-defended. So it seems Abdi-Ashirta gets away with this one. The other kings in the region are outraged, none more so than Rib-Hadda of Byblos, which is called Gubla in the text. We won't go through all of the letters he sent, but here are some highlights. He asks Pharaoh, what is Abdi-Ashirta, servant and dog, that he takes the land of the king for himself? What is his auxiliary force that is so strong? Through the apiru, his auxiliary force is strong. So Rib-Hadda asks for reinforcements for Byblos to defend the city against Abdi-Ashirta and his apiru forces. In another letter, he tries to provoke the pharaoh to action by saying Abdi-Ashirta has not only taken the city, but he slept in the king's bedchambers and helped himself to the royal treasury in Sumer. Amenhotep seems to either believe Abdi-Ashirta or doesn't care enough to respond to his actions. Having a strong vassal on his border may have been a smart geopolitical move. So Abdi-Ashirta was able to retain his holdings and used Sumer as a base of operations to continue to expand his territory, at the expense of other Egyptian vassals. Rib-Hadda again details this for us. Abdi-Ashirta seems to have had a winning formula. He would go to a town and tell them, kill your leader and you will be like us and at peace. Basically, join our peaceful coalition or die. That's at least what he did to a city called Amiya, if Rib-Hadda is to be believed. And apparently the people of Amiya agreed, when the options are kill their king and join Abdi-Ashirta or be put under siege by the peaceful coalition. It's easy to see why they did what they did. Rib-Hadda complains that villages and towns in the mountains are defecting. The real offense is that now Abdi-Ashirta is taking towns once loyal to Rib-Hadda and Byblos, and they're becoming like Habiru, joining Abdi-Ashirta and Amuru. He complains that between captives being taken in combat and people leaving to join the ranks of Abdi-Ashirta, his fields aren't growing. For lack of a cultivator, my field is like a woman without a husband. I'm telling you, these letters are a great read. Rib-Hadda is feeling the squeeze as Abdi-Ashirta is picking up villages and towns and is starting to close in on Byblos as he continues to expand Amuru southward. But Byblos is a large city that is really vital to Egyptian imperial interests. Rib-Hadda asks for reinforcements, as he says, like a bird in a trap, so am I in Gubla. But reinforcements don't come. Rib-Hadda has to sell off items from his own household to survive as Abdi-Ashirta continues to win over towns and villages once loyal to Byblos. Rib-Hadda continues to send letters to Pharaoh telling him of the progress of Abdi-Ashirta. He has taken Shagada and Ampi and is seeking to take the final two cities loyal to Byblos. Rib-Hadda appeals to the dignity or ego of the Pharaoh, and he asks, what is Abdi-Ashirta, the dog, that he strives to take all the cities of the king, the sun, for himself? Is he the king of Matana or the king of Kashu, that he strives to take the land of the king for himself? But Pharaoh remains unmoved. Abdi-Ashirta has done what was previously impossible for Egypt. He had united the unruly elements of southern Syria into a cohesive force, even if he did so at the expense of other loyal vassals, and he essentially created a buffer between Egypt and the aggressive empires to the north. Abdi-Ashirta was still at least nominally loyal to the pharaoh. He couched his conquest in terms of loyalty to the pharaoh. He wasn't conquering, he was shoring up the defenses of the border region by removing disloyal vassals. Even if the pharaoh knew better, the geopolitical reality on the ground is impossible to ignore. He had to be a fan of Abdi-Ashirta's work at a certain level. The only thing Pharaoh did at this point, it seems, was to send some resources towards Byblos, but they got waylaid in Beirut, where we again see Abdi-Ashirta was scheming. Rib-Hadda complains that the king of Beirut has made an alliance with Abdi-Ashirta, so nothing that was sent made it to him. We see that as Abdi-Ashirta continued to the south, not risking confrontation with Mitanni to the north, he established alliances not only with the king of Beirut, but with the king of Sidon and Tyre as well, isolating Byblos and Rib-Hadda even further. Abdi-Ashirta is keeping the pressure on Byblos by securing friendly relations with the major port cities south of Byblos. Now, the nature of these alliances is not clear. If these cities swore fealty to Amuru or what exactly, but Rib-Hadda was isolated. In the following of these political shakeups, kings swearing allegiance to Abdi-Ashirta and Amuru, we find that Rib-Hadda had sent his sister, nieces, and nephews to safety in Tyre, as the territory of Byblos was no longer safe for them. But in all of these shakeups, his relatives were actually killed in Tyre by forces friendly to Abdi-Ashirta. Not only was his sister killed, but Abdi-Ashirta either ordered or inspired an assassination attempt on Rib-Hadda inside Byblos. Rib-Hadda recounts his heroics to Pharaoh, saying that Abdi-Ashirta had tried to inspire a coup, as he did at Amiya, essentially join our peaceful coalition and kill your king or else. And it sort of works at Byblos. He wrote, "They became traitors to me. A man with a bronze dagger attacked me, but I killed him. A Shirdanu whom I know got away to Abdi-Ashirta. At his order was this deed done." At this point, Rib-Hadda is at his wit's end, as Abdi-Ashirta continues to advance. Abdi-Ashirta took Rib-Hadda's second to last city, Patruna, or called Bit Arka in the text, and Rib-Hadda is incredulous with the pharaoh. He says, "Why have you sat idly by and done nothing so that the apiru dog takes your cities? When you took Sumer, I wrote to you, why do you do nothing? Then Bit Arka was taken. When he saw that there was no one that said anything to him about Sumer, his intentions were reinforced so that he strives to take Gubla, or Byblos. Rib-Hadda asks if the pharaoh isn't sending reinforcements, he could at least send a bribe. May you pay 1,000 shekels of silver and 100 shekels of gold, so he will go away from me. I have just heard that he has gathered all the apiru to attack me. What can I do by myself? I go on writing like this for archers and an auxiliary force, but my words go unheeded." It's clear no help is coming from his liege lord. Maybe Rib-Hadda's loyalty is misplaced, and he tells the pharaoh as much. He asks for word back about help, but if it doesn't come, he says, "Or like Yapahada and Zimreda, I will make an alliance with Abdi-Ashirta and stay alive." When it becomes clear that Byblos would fall, the pharaoh seems to have taken action, but not out of concern for Rib-Hadda. In fact, he seems to be quite annoyed with the man. Rib-Hadda quotes a now lost letter from the pharaoh in which the pharaoh says, "Why do you alone keep writing me?" We may read into this that maybe other vassals didn't think the situation was as serious, or that Rib-Hadda really was a bit of a Bronze Age spammer. In any case, the fall of Byblos would have actually impeded Egyptian imperial and commercial ambitions. It was clear Abdi-Ashirta and Amuru were too powerful now. All of the Syrian and Lebanese coast from the Orontes Valley, the border of the Great Kingdom of Mitanni, down to Tyre, owed allegiance primarily to Abdi-Ashirta and Amuru. Abdi-Ashirta's protestations of loyalty could only carry so far. The end of Abdi-Ashirta's Amuru seems to have ended with a military expedition, as seems by the pharaoh. The Habiru forces that made up Abdi-Ashirta's power base were no match for a well-equipped and what at the time equated to a professional army. In a letter which is only partially preserved, we hear of commercial disputes that seem to come in the aftermath of the explicitly stated death of Abdi-Ashirta. The sender of the letter, which is presumably Rib-Hadda, who's no doubt reveling in outlasting his rival, is encouraging the pharaoh to reestablish control over the coastal cities that were once allied with Amuru and are now unsure what to do following the death of Abdi-Ashirta. They all backed the wrong horse and don't know where they stand anymore. In the end, for all of his exploits, we don't know how Abdi-Ashirta died or even the timing of his death. Did he die in a pitched battle, heroically fighting against a superior Egyptian force? Did he die in a siege? Was he surrounded by the army he forged around himself, or was he abandoned when things got difficult? Was he assassinated by his own men? Were they offered a similar ultimatum to the ones that he gave so many other cities? Kill your king and join us or die? Fortunately, we don't know. But no matter how he died, we can say that Abdi-Ashirta proved to be a truly capable politician and military commander. He forged together a large force of otherwise disaffected vagrants around himself, no doubt in large part because of his own personal charisma. He built a polity along the Syrian coast that proved to be powerful enough to eventually acquire military intervention by one of the great empires of its day.
So, at this point you may be thinking, neat, so what? Why did I just sit through a Bronze Age soap opera? Well, maybe you're a history buff and you enjoy these kinds of things, but maybe you're really just interested in the ancient world as it pertains to the Bible. So, why on this channel would we talk about a man who's never mentioned in the Bible, whose life has no real bearing on any biblical story or account, and who even occupies a period that is largely skipped over in the narrative of the New Testament? Well, there are a few takeaways from this story that may be helpful for readers of the Bible. Well, first, we think this is a good and hopefully interesting exercise in reconstructing history from the texts that we've received. This is a practice and a skill that has to be learned and developed by readers of ancient history. Historians and archaeologists both do this, taking disparate data points and connecting the dots and filling in the gaps. This isn't just an academic skill, but one that can help otherwise confusing passages of the Bible make sense by learning how to responsibly fill in some context. Grammar and syntax are not all that you need for a good hermeneutic. The context around a text, the time and circumstances in which it was written, those are all important as well. Now, is this the end-all be-all for interpretation? Well, of course not. But it can help us in the interpretive process. Elucidating that context requires careful reading and exercising those learned skills. Now, this may be low stakes for the story of Abdi-Ashirta. There is a more than decent chance that we didn't reconstruct the entire story right just now. But that's okay. Very few people are impacted by it. But there are times when this is relevant for how we read the Bible. Take, for example, the letters to the Corinthians. The letters preserved in the Bible are not the whole story. We have 2 or maybe 3 letters in a larger sequence. In fact, Paul explicitly makes reference in 1 Corinthians to a previous letter to the church in Corinth. So there's clearly more to their relationship than what's preserved in the Bible. We have just a couple points in a much larger web of connections. We have one side of a larger back and forth. But from what we do have, we can reconstruct some of the circumstances that both precipitated and followed the reception of these letters, with careful readings of the text. Now, does knowing the background, that back and forth that we don't have anymore, forever alter our understanding of these letters? Well, again, we don't think it does. But it can enrich it. We absolutely think that it has value there. Now, beyond a somewhat theoretical value for hermeneutics, we also want to note something else about the story of Abdi-Ashirta and Amuru and how we evaluate historicity. We wouldn't know about Abdi-Ashirta or Amuru without the Amarna Letters. We don't read about him or his kingdom in texts from Mitanni or Babylon or Assyria or Anatolia, not even in any other Egyptian inscriptions. We only have a record of him in the Amarna Letters. And we don't find a strong archaeological signature for Abdi-Ashirta either. But no one would argue that these events didn't happen. People may say Rib-Hadda exaggerated more than a few things, but the core of Abdi-Ashirta's story, a charismatic leader uniting a disparate group of disaffected people and forging a sizable kingdom for himself, all that is not in dispute. Despite no other records and no strong archaeological support for a state formation process or markers of statehood in Amuru, the historicity of Abdi-Ashirta's reign is not in dispute. So, this story, we think, is helpful to keep in mind when we read certain stories in the Hebrew Bible. In Judges 11, Jephthah seems to have set up a small fiefdom for himself in a land called Tob. It was sizable enough that the Israelites sought him out to help them against the kingdom of Ammon. We see in Judges 9 a charismatic figure ruthlessly setting themselves up as king, only to be killed a few years later. Should we doubt the veracity of these stories because they're only attested in the Bible without other evidence outside of it? Well, maybe, but not because they're only attested in one place. If we learn anything from the Abdi-Ashirta story, it may be that we should be careful to call into question the historicity of ancient accounts just because they're only attested in one body of literature. This is a tendency that seems to be popular when it comes to the Bible, but less common with other ancient texts. The academic community has, for a very long time, engaged in a debate about the veracity and the historicity of the early kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. There are articles about state formation and the archaeological manifestation of early Israelite states. There is a lot that's discussed, something we could get into in the future, but not today. Now, we will note, with the early kings, as with the stories in Judges, these texts are in a long textual tradition. We don't have contemporary archaeologically recovered textual sources attesting to them the way we do with Abdi-Ashirta. We have stories that were written down at some point after perhaps oral circulation for who knows how long, and then they were copied and likely amended over time. So, questions of historicity when it comes to the Bible may stem from that preservation process, but they shouldn't arise from us only having these stories preserved in the Bible alone, which is a charge that's leveled against the historicity of these figures with surprising frequency. David's kingdom is not mentioned in contemporary texts from neighboring kingdoms, but neither was Abdi-Ashirta. Yet we see many parallels. We see a charismatic figure building a large kingdom using a ragtag bunch of soldiers that he gathered around himself. That sounds an awful lot like the stories in 1 Samuel and the rise of David. And does it prove David ruled over a huge empire exactly the way the Bible spells it out? Well, no. But it's a helpful reminder that there are people and events from ancient history that are now completely lost to us today. Just because they aren't attested, or they're only attested in one source, even years after the fact, it doesn't mean that these events didn't happen. What we can say is that while Abdi-Ashirta may have no direct bearing on our discussion of, say, David's kingdom, we can look to it as precedent for a charismatic figure building a large, if ephemeral, kingdom in the ancient Near East. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe and check out our video on the Amarna Letters or our overview of the Late Bronze Age. You can also check out our website, beneaththebible.com, and follow us on social media at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a second to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.